In 1868, Japan was a country on the verge of collapse. From 1600 to 1868, the country had been ruled by a military dictatorship known as the Tokugawa shogunate. While it did usher in an age of peace and stability, it also created a rigid class system, suppressed any form of dissent, and implemented policies that prevented Japan from engaging in meaningful trade with the rest of the world. By the mid-19th century, the country was dangerously isolated and on the brink of poverty. But then suddenly, everything changed. Over the course of just 4 decades, Japan went from being a poor, isolated country to becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world. This incredible transformation is what we'll be looking at in this video, so buckle up. This video is part of a series on the history of Japan. If you want to watch more, check out the playlist. Meiji is a name that refers to both a historical period and an emperor. Technically speaking, the Meiji era lasted from 1868 to 1912, which was when Emperor Meiji passed away. However, it's also the name given to the sweeping set of reforms that took place during his reign. The man who spearheaded these changes was not the emperor himself, but rather his chief advisor, a man named Eto Hirobumi. After graduating from the military academy, Ito had become an advisor to the shogunate and quickly rose through the ranks. Because of his intelligence and knowledge of Western affairs. When the first group of samurai arrived in America in 1863, Ito personally requested to join them so that he could study their military and industrial technology. He was particularly impressed with the American system of elected government, which planted the seeds for him to eventually support the overthrow of the shogunate and the restoration of power to the emperor. Ito's initial plan was to simply advise the young emperor on how to rule the country more effectively. But in order to do that, he first needed to make sure that the emperor would actually listen to him. In 1866, a group of samurai kidnapped the shogun's son and presented him to the emperor as a hostage. Then 2 years later, Ito led a successful coup d'etat against the shogun and restored power to the emperor. With the shogunate officially dissolved in 1871, all of Japan came under the direct control of the central government for the first time in history. With power now consolidated, the true work of modernization began. The first priority was to fix Japan's economy. The country's treasury was nearly bankrupt, and there were very few industries that could compete with Western products. In order to address this, Ito implemented a series of economic reforms aimed at turning Japan into an industrial powerhouse. This included establishing the world's first national bank, introducing a new paper currency, and building factories to produce military weapons and ammunition. To fund these endeavors, the government levied new taxes and began selling government bonds. And while unpopular, these measures proved effective in strengthening the economy and are largely credited with transforming Japan into one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The next priority was to modernize Japan's military. Up until the mid-19th century, the country's army and navy consisted of samurai and their swords. But in order to fight off potential Western invaders, they needed to be outfitted with the latest firearms and naval technology. Between 1873 and 1881, the Japanese military underwent a process of rapid modernization, which included establishing conscription, building new shipyards, training foreign officers, and introducing cutting-edge weaponry. By 1881, Japan's military was not only strong enough to defend the country from foreign powers, but also invade other countries. The third priority was to reform Japanese society. As we mentioned earlier, Japanese society was rigidly stratified with the samurai at the top. Farmers, artisans, and merchants below them, and everyone else at the bottom. This rigid system worked well during the peaceful Edo period, but no longer made sense in an industrializing world where social mobility was a reality. In 1871, the government abolished the feudal domains and the hereditary titles of the samurai. They were then granted land in exchange for their loyalty, which turned many of them into rich landowners. At the same time, the government also introduced a new legal code based on Western laws. These reforms were extremely controversial and sparked a series of revolts known as the Satsuma and Hakamazu rebellions. But in the end, they paved the way for a more modern and egalitarian society. The fourth and final priority was to open diplomatic relations with foreign powers. Since 1639, Japan had been closed off from the rest of the world with only Chinese and Dutch traders allowed into the country. For over 200 years, this policy remained unchanged despite the best efforts of Western missionaries and the increasing number of Japanese sailors and merchants who traveled abroad. But ultimately, it was gunboat diplomacy that forced Japan to open its borders. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay with a fleet of American warships, demanding that Japan open up a consulate. Fearing that the Americans would come back with a larger fleet and force them to do it anyway, the shoguns agreed. And over the next decade, a flurry of treaties were signed that opened up Japan to international trade. And there you have it. Those were the main reforms of the Meiji Restoration. And yet, despite these tremendous accomplishments, within just 4 decades, Japan went from being a poor, isolated country to becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world. So how did this happen? Well, there are 3 reasons for Japan's sudden rise. First, the timing was perfect. Japan's modernization took place during the Second Industrial Revolution, which took place between 1870 and 1914. During this time, technological innovation was at an all-time high, and several European nations like Germany and Italy had recently modernized. So it wasn't like Japan was starting from scratch. They could learn from the mistakes and successes of their predecessors. Secondly, Japan's government was highly effective. Unlike most countries whose governments are characterized by infighting and bureaucracy, Japan's government was highly efficient and driven towards a common goal. Lastly, Japan benefited from something called the Lewisian explosion. If you're not familiar with the term, let me explain. In economics, the Lewisian explosion describes the rapid economic growth that occurs when a poor country introduces labor-saving technology into their industries. In other words, if you take a poor country and introduce them to tractors, the workers will become more productive and their economy will grow faster than usual. This is exactly what happened in Japan. Before the Meiji Restoration, the vast majority of the population worked in low-productivity jobs like farming. But after the Restoration, the government invested heavily into industrialization, which gave millions of Japanese workers higher-paying jobs in factories. In fact, the entire country became so wealthy that the government was able to offer generous pensions to the elderly and cheap education to children. As you can see, the Meiji Restoration was an extraordinary accomplishment that literally transformed Japan into a modern country. However, even though the country was thriving economically, there were still some major problems. First, the gap between the rich and the poor was growing wider every year. While industrialization brought wealth to most of the country, the richest 1% of the population controlled 40% of all the land. Secondly, many of the old samurai class were left behind by the rapidly changing times. Despite being given land that made them some of the wealthiest landowners in the country, many of them couldn't find new jobs and ended up becoming destitute. Finally, the new constitution that was introduced during the Meiji Restoration didn't really allow for much political participation. Although elections were held, only a small percentage of the population was allowed to vote, and the military had supreme authority over the government. All of these issues would come to a head in 1931, when Japan's military leaders staged a coup d'etat and turned the country into a totalitarian state.